All right, I'm going to give you just a couple of, several pointers as you go through this reading chapter. The nice thing is you can see my ebook version, so you can follow along. You can also use your textbook. I'm on page 186. So certainly the chapter has objectives that you want to look at. There are learning objectives on page 184. I think those are good, definitely, to use as a reference as you're going through the chapter. It will only help you in terms of having a better learning experience. I would kind of look at your reading and see how they tie into the objectives. Certainly not the expectation that you memorize every term here, but you will be seeing these terms throughout your PTA career. So I think it's good to get familiar with them, but I'm not asking you to memorize them all. So the common conditions section, you really need to know that this is, again, these little pearls of definitions. That bursitis is an inflammation of the bursa. Within our joints, we have these fluid-filled sacs that can become irritated when they're pinched, or the joint is overused, or the mechanics of the joint is being compromised by faulty body mechanics, for example. Tendinopathy is just that overuse of tendons. Wrist tendons are common ones that can get overused through certain activities or sports. We have some biceps tendons that certainly can be overused if someone is lifting too much, and there may be a rapid overstretch when a weight is not controlled, going into elbow extension from flexion, for example. But an injury because of repeated use or rapid overstretching can result in a tendinopathy, or just a real painful inflammation of a tendon. Nerve entrapment, we'll get more into that as we get into winter term and spring term, but sometimes that referral of tingling, numbness can be a result of a nerve being pinched, such as in the low back, for example. Carpal tunnel syndrome, for example, is used by the author. I really want you to know what a sprain is versus a strain. They are very different. A ligament sprain, it would be an ankle, is the most common one that we are familiar with. Those outside ligaments are overstretched when we're rolling the ankle. And then a muscle strain is an excessive stretch. So common muscle strain is a hamstring muscle strain, just being overstretched through a particular sport, or contact on the ground causing a muscle to be excessively stretched can cause a strain. You all know the definition of a fracture. I do want you to know what a total joint replacement is. That is replacing both surfaces within a joint. So an example would be, for example, the distal femur, and then the proximal tibia, and in the event that someone's having a knee replacement. So it's a replacement of joint surfaces. An amputation, I don't think I need to really get into that. So as we're going through the chapter, I don't want you to split too many hairs about questions typically asked of a PT initial evaluation. I want you to take a look at that, but I'm not the expectation that you memorize that in your role as assistants. But certainly, I think it's too much expectation to ask you to know all that. I do think test and measures is something I do want you to know, such as the difference between active range of motion. This patient, for example, is doing active range of motion in image A as well as B. Assisted passive range of motion is when you're actually helping someone lift their arm or leg up, for example. Those are the two differences, and tools are used to measure, such as goniometers. You get more into that next term. And to get into this whole grading of manual muscle tests, and familiar with 0 would be no movement of a muscle. An example of a supported and horizontal plane, which would be a 2. I'm not asking to learn minuses and pluses, but a 2 would be, for example, someone has their arm on a mat or like a table and they're moving it from side to side, so there's no gravity involved, whereas a 3 involves raising the arm against gravity, like doing a biceps curl. 4 would be, and again, I'm not splitting hairs over 1s and minuses and pluses, but a 4 would be being able to lift a weight, for example, a light weight, hold the position against moderate pressure. And then a 5 would be to hold resistance against strong pressure, so a therapist providing some resistance. So don't split hairs over that table. I think it's a bit much to expect you to know that information. Flexibility is essentially, moving a joint through a specific range of motion and, applying mild, moderate pressure, not extreme pressure, because, of course, if you're doing too much pressure, you could injure a joint. Activities of daily living, I think, certainly get familiar with these. These are functional tasks, but you don't have to memorize all those in different categories right now. I think that's asking a bit much. I think this is a great scale, but again, you're not required to memorize that. I think it's good to look through it because you can kind of get some ideas about activities that you and I may take for granted, but someone with a health condition may be an entirely different story. And I think this scale is very good, the lower extremity functional scale. And then we have some pictures of special tests. I'm not asking you to memorize any of these special tests, so you can just kind of skim through that. That is asking way too much. You'll be getting into that winter and spring term. And then some interventions that you've already practiced, such as body mechanics, are shown here. Using some agents for musculoskeletal problems. And PTA 101 lab and lecture, you're going to be introduced to superficial heat and cold these coming weeks, as well as electrical stim. I'm not asking you to memorize all of these, but I do want you to start to get familiar with some of the temperatures of these different modalities, such as a hot pack. I think the 135 degrees is certainly industry standard, and you want to keep that hydrocollator at a certain temperature when you're doing paraffin. So let me just rephrase that. So let's not memorize paraffin heat. Let's just skip about even the hot pack heat. I don't want you memorizing a certain number. I'm stepping back from that. And then the last section would be getting familiar with some of these other agents. Again, names. Ultrasound would be an example. Manual therapy, soft tissue isn't a word for massage. Joint mobilization. You don't need to memorize that, but certainly know or the definition. But know that it is something that is used when a joint has low mobility. So it's mobilized in a specific joint, not soft tissue. And know the categories of exercise, range of motion, resistance. I think that's really important. Some examples of that. Get familiar with the term core training. Balance. And then finally, I think the section on precautions around aquatic therapy, you'll learn this in more detail on 101 lecture. But to know the precautions and the description of aquatic therapy, I do want you to know these two categories. And that covers this chapter.